Alaska, February 2000. A place where winter silence can swallow secrets whole, where the vastness of the landscape mirrors the emptiness left by unanswered questions. In a small community where everyone knows everyone, where doors are left unlocked and neighbors watch out for one another, something happened that would shake the foundation of trust itself. A young woman vanished. Her name was Sophie Sergi, and for 20 years her story remained frozen in time, preserved in evidence boxes and fading memories. The case file grew cold. The leads dried up. The community moved on, though the weight of the unknown never quite lifted. And then, 2 decades later, in a moment that seemed to defy the passage of time itself, an arrest was made. A man was taken into custody, someone who had been walking among the living all those years while Sophie remained forever 20. The news traveled fast through that tight-knit community, leaving shock and disbelief in its wake. How could this be? How could someone carry such darkness for so long? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what took so long to find the truth? The winter of 2000 came to Fairbanks, Alaska, the way it always did, with a particular kind of silence that only extreme cold can bring. The city sits in the heart of Alaska's interior, a place where temperatures can plummet to 40 below zero, where the sun barely crests the horizon in deepest winter, offering only a few hours of pale twilight before darkness returns. The University of Alaska Fairbanks sprawled across the hillside, its buildings connected by a network of heated tunnels called utilidors, because walking outside between classes in February could mean frostbite in minutes. Students hurried from dorm to classroom, their breath crystallizing in the air, their faces hidden behind scarves and parkas. Sophie Sergi was 20 years old that April. She had grown up in Pitka's Point, a tiny Yupik village on the Yukon River Delta, population barely 100 souls. Like many young people from the villages, she had come to Fairbanks seeking opportunity, education, a glimpse of a larger world. She had attended the university briefly but had taken time off, working various jobs, figuring out her path the way 20-year-olds do. She had a bright smile that people remembered, a warmth that seemed to counter the Arctic cold. She loved music. She loved dancing. She had dreams that extended beyond the small radius of her rural upbringing. On April 26, 2000, Sophie traveled to Fairbanks from the village where she was staying. She came to visit friends, to reconnect with the student life she had briefly known. The details of her movements that day have been reconstructed through witness statements and records. She arrived at the Bartlett Hall dormitory in the early evening hours. Bartlett Hall was a co-ed residence, 4 stories of cream-colored concrete and large windows, housing dozens of students in small rooms with shared bathrooms down the hall. The building hummed with the ordinary sounds of student life, voices echoing in stairwells, doors opening and closing, the distant thump of music from someone's room. Sophie had come to see her friend, a young woman who lived on one of the upper floors. They spent time together that evening, talking, catching up, sharing stories the way friends do when weeks have passed between visits. The dormitory was warm after the cold outside, the radiators clanking and hissing. Other students passed in the hallways, barely noticing the young woman with dark hair and a friendly face. She was just another visitor, another familiar presence in a building where people came and went constantly. Clear's throat. Sometime after 10 o'clock that night, Sophie told her friend she was going to take a bath. The bathrooms in Bartlett Hall were communal, shared facilities at the end of each hallway with multiple stalls, sinks, and a bathtub. It was the kind of setup common in older dormitories, requiring a certain level of comfort with semi-public spaces. Sophie gathered her things and walked down the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere a television played. the ordinary sounds of an ordinary night. She never returned. The timeline of what happened next has been pieced together from fragments, from the recollections of residents who heard something or saw something or noticed the absence of sound. Sometime in those late evening hours, while most students were winding down for the night or studying or talking on the phone, Sophie Sergi was attacked in that bathroom. The violence was extreme. The brutality was shocking. And when it was over, her body was left in the bathtub, the water still running, the steam rising in the small tiled room. It was another student who found her. The next morning, April 27th, a young woman entered the bathroom to begin her morning routine. The scream that followed brought others running. Within minutes, the dormitory erupted into chaos. Resident advisors called campus security. Campus security called the Fairbanks Police Department. Officers arrived to find a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. Sophie had been stabbed. She had been strangled. She had been violated in ways that spoke to rage, to something darker than simple violence. The bathroom had become a crime scene, the white tiles now marked with evidence of struggle. The water in the tub was cold by then, hours having passed since the attack. Her clothes lay scattered. The door had no lock, just a simple latch that anyone could open. The investigation began immediately, with the urgency that attends any violent crime, but especially one that happens in what should be a safe space, a place where young people sleep and study and live their lives. Fairbanks police detectives swarmed the building. They interviewed every resident on that floor, then every resident in the building. They collected evidence methodically: fibers, fingerprints, biological samples. They photographed everything. They documented every detail of the scene with the precision that modern forensic science demands. The dormitory became a place of whispers and fear. Students clustered in groups, their voices low, their eyes wide. How could this happen here? Who could do such a thing? The university administration issued statements about safety and support. Counselors were made available. Extra security was posted. But underneath the official response was a current of terror that no amount of reassurance could quite dispel. The search for answers began with the residents of Bartlett Hall itself. Detectives worked through the list of everyone who had access to the building that night. In theory, the dormitory required key card access, but the reality was messier. Students propped doors open. Friends visited. The building was not a fortress but a living space where dozens of young people came and went with the casual familiarity of home. Anyone could have been in that hallway. Anyone could have entered that bathroom. Investigators collected DNA evidence from the scene. This was 2000, when DNA technology was becoming increasingly sophisticated but still required careful handling and processing. Samples were sent to the Alaska State Crime Lab. The hope was that the biological evidence would provide a match, would point directly to the perpetrator. But when the results came back, there was no match in any database. The DNA belonged to someone unknown, someone who had left their genetic signature at the scene, but whose identity remained a mystery. The community response was immediate and intense. In a place like Fairbanks, where the population was small enough that degrees of separation collapsed quickly, Sophie's death was personal. She had connections to the native community, to the university, to the web of relationships that bound the city together. Vigils were held. Prayers were offered. Her family traveled from Pitca's Point, devastated, seeking answers that the police could not yet provide. Those who knew Sophie spoke of her warmth, her kindness. They described a young woman who was finding her way, who had dreams and plans and people who loved her. The loss was profound, made worse by the violence of her death, by the randomness of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or was it random? Detectives began to wonder if Sophie had been targeted, if her attacker had known her, had been waiting for an opportunity. The investigation expanded outward in concentric circles. Detectives looked at Sophie's recent contacts, her friends, anyone she might have mentioned or met. They investigated known offenders in the area, anyone with a history of violence. They conducted polygraph examinations of persons of interest. They followed leads that led nowhere, chased shadows that dissolved under scrutiny. Clear's throat. The physical evidence was processed and reprocessed. The DNA remained the most promising lead, but without a match, it was simply data waiting for context. Fingerprints from the scene were run through databases. Witness statements were compared and cross-referenced. The timeline was reconstructed hour by hour, minute by minute. Sophie had been alive at 10:15 when she left her friend's room. She had been found dead at 7:30 the next morning. Somewhere in those 9 hours, her life had been stolen. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the nature of the crime, about the level of violence, about what kind of person could do this and then simply walk away. The brutality suggested rage, but the cleanup suggested calculation. The attacker had not panicked, had not fled in obvious haste. There were indications that an attempt had been made to obscure evidence, to stage the scene. This was not the work of someone in the grip of uncontrolled passion. This was something colder. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to slow. The initial burst of activity gave way to the grinding work of following up on tips that led nowhere, of waiting for lab results that provided no new answers, of hopping for a break that never came. The case remained open, but the active investigation wound down. Detectives moved on to other cases, though Sophie's file remained on desks, a reminder of unfinished business. The case went cold. The years that followed were marked by the weight of absence. For Sophie's family, the grief never lessened, though it changed shape over time. Her mother, her siblings, her extended family in Pitca's Point carried the loss with them through every season, every holiday, every milestone that Sophie would never reach. The village held her memory close, but the distance between the small community on the Yukon Delta and the investigative apparatus in Fairbanks felt vast and unbridgeable. In Fairbanks, the university community gradually moved on, as communities must. New students arrived who had never heard of Sophie Sergi. Bartlett Hall continued to house residents, though older students sometimes mentioned the bathroom where it happened. The story passed down like a ghost tale. The case became part of local lore, a cautionary story about vulnerability, about the darkness that can intrude into even the most ordinary spaces. But for the detectives who had worked the case, Sophie was never forgotten. Her file remained in the cold case division, one of dozens of unsolved homicides that haunted the department. Periodically, an investigator would pull the file, review the evidence, search for something that had been missed. The DNA evidence sat in storage, waiting for technology to catch up, for databases to expand, for the moment when science might provide the answer that traditional investigation could not. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the slow erosion of trust that comes from unanswered questions, the years after a violent crime create a particular kind of hell. People look at each other differently. They wonder. They question their own memories and perceptions. In a community as interconnected as Fairbanks, where Sophie's case remained unsolved, there was always the unspoken knowledge that the person responsible might still be among them, might be someone they knew, someone they passed on the street or sat next to in church. The psychological weight of an unsolved case ripples outward in ways both visible and hidden. Some of Sophie's friends left Alaska altogether, unable to reconcile their memories of university life with the violence that had shattered it. Others stayed but carried a wariness that had not been there before. Doors that had once been left unlocked now had deadbolts. Women who had once walked alone at night now traveled in groups. The sense of safety had been irrevocably altered. The case file grew thicker with supplemental reports as investigators periodically revisited the evidence. New techniques in DNA analysis were applied as they became available. The original samples were retested using more sensitive methods. The genetic profile was refined and clarified. But still, there was no match, no name to attach to the biological signature. In 2018, 18 years after Sophie's death, something shifted. Advances in genetic genealogy had begun to revolutionize cold case investigation. The same DNA databases that people used to trace their ancestry, to find distant cousins and build family trees, could also be used to identify unknown subjects in criminal cases. The technique had been used successfully in California to identify the Golden State Killer, and suddenly law enforcement agencies around the country were taking notice. The Alaska State Troopers and Fairbanks Police Department decided to apply this new technology to Sophie's case. They took the DNA profile from the crime scene and submitted it to a genetic genealogy database. This was not a simple match like running DNA through CODIS, the FBI's criminal database. This was genealogical detective work, using shared DNA segments to identify distant relatives, then building family trees to find common ancestors, then working forward through generations to narrow down potential suspects. The process took months. Genetic genealogists worked backward through family lines, identifying second cousins and third cousins who shared portions of DNA with the unknown subject. They built elaborate family trees using public records, census data, birth certificates, marriage licenses. They traced branches of families across states and decades, and slowly the list of potential suspects narrowed. By early 2019, investigators had identified a specific family line. They began looking at male members of that family who would have been the right age in 2000, who would have had the opportunity to be in Fairbanks on that April night. The list grew shorter. Background checks were run. Movements and locations were verified, and one name emerged with particular clarity. Stephen Downs, a man who had been a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in April 2000, a man who had lived in Bartlett Hall, the same dormitory where Sophie Sergi was killed, a man who had been there in that building on that night. Clear's throat. The revelation was stunning in its simplicity and its horror. All those years, all that searching, and the answer had been there from the beginning. Downs had been among the students interviewed in the initial investigation. He had provided statements. He had been on the list. But without DNA technology to connect him to the crime scene, there had been no way to identify him as the perpetrator. He had walked away, had graduated, had moved out of state, had built a life while Sophie's family waited for answers. Investigators moved carefully. They needed to confirm the genetic genealogy findings with a direct DNA sample from Downs himself. Covert surveillance was established. Investigators tracked his movements, waited for an opportunity to obtain a discarded item that might contain his DNA. This is delicate work, requiring patience and precision. The legal requirements for collecting and processing such samples are stringent, and investigators knew that any misstep could jeopardize the case. In February 2019, investigators obtained a sample. The details of how remained part of the investigative record, but the result was clear. The DNA matched. Stephen Downs, now 46 years old, living in Auburn, Maine, was genetically connected to the crime scene in Bartlett Hall. The case that had been cold for 19 years was suddenly very hot. On February 14, 2019, Valentine's Day, investigators from multiple agencies descended on Auburn, Maine. The coordinated effort involved Alaska State Troopers, Fairbanks Police, and local Maine law enforcement. They found Stephen Downs and took him into custody. The arrest was quiet, professional, unremarkable to anyone watching. But for those who knew what it meant, for those who had waited nearly 2 decades for this moment, it was earth-shattering. News of the arrest reached Fairbanks within hours. The local media picked up the story immediately. Headlines announced what seemed impossible, an arrest in the Sophie Sergi case. After 19 years, after all the cold trails and dead ends and fading hope. The reaction in the community was electric, a mixture of shock, relief, vindication, and renewed grief. Those who had known Sophie, who had carried her memory through 2 decades, suddenly found themselves confronting the reality that justice might finally be possible. But with that possibility came a flood of emotions that had been held in suspension. The pain was fresh again. The loss was immediate. And there were questions, so many questions. Why had it taken so long? How had he evaded detection? Had there been signs that were missed? The University of Alaska Fairbanks issued a statement acknowledging the arrest and expressing support for Sophie's family, and for the investigative team that had never given up. Former students who had been in Bartlett Hall that night in 2000 learned the news through social media and phone calls, the information spreading rapidly through networks of people who had scattered across the country, but remained connected by that shared experience of trauma. Stephen Downs was extradited from Maine to Alaska to face charges. The legal process began with arraignment, the formal reading of charges, the entry of a plea. Downs pleaded not guilty, as is his right in the American legal system. His defense attorneys began the work of reviewing the evidence, preparing for trial, challenging the genetic genealogy techniques that had led to his identification. The prosecution built its case around the DNA evidence, which was powerful but not infallible in the eyes of the law. Genetic genealogy was still relatively new in criminal prosecutions, and defense attorneys around the country had begun raising questions about privacy, about the reliability of family tree research, about the potential for error. But in this case, the evidence was not just genealogical. There was the direct DNA match from the sample obtained in 2019. There was Downs' presence in the dormitory on the night of Sophie's death. There was his access to that hallway, that bathroom. Those who had believed in his innocence, if there were any, found themselves grappling with cognitive dissonance. How could someone they knew, someone who had seemed ordinary, be capable of such violence? But those who study criminal psychology know that monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like neighbors, like classmates, like the person sitting next to you on the bus. The community divided, as communities do in the face of such revelations. There were those who wanted swift justice, who saw the DNA evidence as irrefutable proof of guilt. There were others who urged caution, who reminded everyone that an arrest is not a conviction, that the legal process must be allowed to unfold. And there were those who simply felt numb, overwhelmed by the weight of nearly 2 decades of waiting suddenly collapsing into the present moment. Sophie's family traveled to Alaska for the court proceedings. Her mother, aged now by 20 years of grief and the hard living of rural Alaska, sat in the courtroom and looked at the man accused of taking her daughter's life. The pain on her face was visible to everyone present. This was not abstract justice. This was personal, immediate, a confrontation with the reality of loss that had defined her life for 2 decades. The trial process moved through the machinery of the legal system with the deliberate pace that justice requires. Pretrial hearings addressed questions of evidence admissibility, witness testimony, legal standards for genetic genealogy. The prosecution presented its case to grand juries. The defense filed motions. The wheels turned slowly, but they turned. In 2022, 3 years after the arrest, the case went to trial. The Fairbanks courtroom was packed with spectators, media, and family members. The prosecution laid out the timeline of that April night in 2000, walking the jury through Sophie's movements, the discovery of her body, the evidence collected at the scene. They presented the DNA evidence, explaining the science behind genetic matching, the statistical probability that the DNA belonged to anyone other than Stephen Downs. The numbers were astronomical. The odds of a random match so infinitesimal as to be effectively impossible. Expert witnesses testified about DNA analysis, about the reliability of the testing methods, about the chain of custody that ensured the integrity of the evidence. The jury heard from the original investigators, now retired but still carrying the weight of the case they had worked all those years ago. They heard from the student who had found Sophie's body, the trauma of that morning still evident in her voice after more than 2 decades. The defense challenged the evidence, as was their duty. They raised questions about contamination, about the possibility of error, about the gap between genetic genealogy identifying a family line and proving beyond reasonable doubt that this specific individual was the perpetrator. They presented character witnesses who spoke to Downs' life in the years since 2000, his work, his family, his community involvement. They argued that the presence of DNA did not necessarily prove culpability, that there could be innocent explanations. But the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA matched. Downs had been in the building. He had access. He had opportunity. And the violence of the crime spoke to something that went beyond random chance or innocent coincidence. The jury deliberated. The weight of their decision was immense. A young woman's life had been stolen. A family had waited nearly a quarter century for answers. The defendant sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, his future in the hands of 12 strangers who had been asked to determine truth based on evidence and testimony and the standard of reasonable doubt. On February 27, 2022, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in quiet tears and whispered prayers. Sophie's family embraced, their bodies shaking with the release of 2 decades of tension. Justice had come, late but not absent, imperfect but real. Stephen Downs was sentenced to 99 years in prison, effectively a life sentence. He was 49 years old. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying the price for what he had done in that dormitory bathroom in April 2000. The sentence would not bring Sophie back. It would not erase the pain or the years of waiting, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that her life had mattered, that her death demanded accountability, that justice, however delayed, was still justice. The case of Sophie Sergi stands as a testament to the power of persistence, to the value of forensic science, to the importance of never giving up on the victims who cannot speak for themselves. It demonstrates how new technologies can breathe life into cold cases, how genetic genealogy can provide answers that traditional investigation cannot. But it also reveals the human cost of delayed justice, the decades of pain endured by families who wait and wonder and hope. For the investigators who worked the case across 2 decades, who kept Sophie's file active when it would have been easier to let it fade into obscurity, the conviction represented vindication. Their instinct that the answer was findable, that the evidence held the truth, had been proven correct. The community in Fairbanks found a measure of closure, though the knowledge that Sophie's killer had lived among them for years, had walked the same streets, had breathed the same air, would always leave a residue of unease. Clears throat. Sophie Sergi was 20 years old when she died. She would have been 42 at the time of the trial. She might have had children. She might have built a career. She might have returned to Pitca's Point to give back to her community, or she might have made a life somewhere else entirely. All those possibilities were stolen from her in a moment of violence that took minutes but reverberated across decades. Her story matters not just because justice was eventually served, but because she was a person who deserved better than the ending she received. She was loved. She was mourned. She was remembered even when the investigation went cold, even when years passed without answers. And in the end, through the dedication of investigators and the advancement of science, her case was solved. Her killer was identified. The truth emerged from 2 decades of silence. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.